In rare good news today, we've learned that the Biden administration has canceled a signature Trump-era rule that would have allowed for companies to reclassify workers as independent contractors. This is so important, guys, because if you take a look at what has happened in California after the passage of Prop 22, you can really understand and grasp how disastrous this Trump-era rule would have been for workers across the country. Now, the Biden administration rescinded the pro-business regulation without replacing it with a new interpretation of when workers can function as independent contractors and when they must be classified as employees under federal law who are entitled to minimum wage and overtime pay. So the reason why it's a problem to just allow for these businesses to reclassify workers willy-nilly is because if they can reclassify you as an independent contractor, you don't get many of the on-the-job protections that typical employees get. Things like workers' compensation, things like, in some cases, healthcare, right? The benefits that workers typically get as part of the job, independent contractors don't get those benefits. Now, Jessica Luman, who is with the Department of Labor for the Biden administration, said that the misclassification of employees as independent contractors presents one of the most serious problems facing workers today. We are committed to continuing to combat misclassification, and we're particularly focused in sectors where we know workers are vulnerable and violations are rampant. She also says that Trump's simplified test for determining employee status would have frankly resulted in more workers potentially being classified as independent contractors instead of employees, which means that they would not have had the protections of the Fair Labor Standards Act. I can't underestimate, and I don't want you to underestimate how good this news is. If you're a worker in this country, and I'm sure most of you are, this is fantastic news. And I would encourage the Biden administration and the Labor Department to go even further to offer more protections for workers, including people who currently are classified as independent contractors. Now, let's also talk a little bit about what happened in California so you can understand why workers in other states have really dodged a bullet here. So in California, these app-based employers, and I'm talking about Instacart, Uber, Lyft, all of those types of companies, fought aggressively to pass something known as Prop 22. And Prop 22 would allow for them to reclassify workers as independent contractors. They spent quite a bit of money to get this done. And unfortunately, that ballot initiative did pass, and now workers in California are suffering the consequences of it. Let's take a look at this video because I think it gives you a good idea of just how disastrous it's been.
In California, gig economy companies have written a new law to suit themselves, spending the most money ever on a California ballot proposition, passing last week with 58% of the vote. Companies like Uber, Lyft, and Instacart spent more than $200 million to gather support for Proposition 22, which exempts them from a 2019 law that would have turned their drivers into employees. Some labor experts worry that this is the beginning of the end of worker protections.
Prop 22 is probably the most dangerous labor law that has been passed or voted on in my lifetime. They've sort of taken a desire that companies have had for, since capitalism began, which is to keep labor costs as low as possible.
What drivers don't get is paid time off, sick days, or unemployment insurance. That could save these companies 20% on employee costs. And as independent contractors, legal challenges will be more difficult than they are for employees. Steve Gregg says he doesn't feel protected.
I feel manipulated and exploited. I don't feel spoken for.
Gregg did 16,000 rides as a full-time driver for Uber and Lyft until the pandemic hit.
Oh, I love the work because I just fell in love with the human race doing this. And I stayed a driver despite the decreases in pay.
He says that Proposition 22 will make it impossible to earn a living driving full-time.
They're trying to push it down into a minimum wage job. You should get paid by tips.
He's right about that. And unfortunately, after Prop 22 passed, many of the drivers who were promised all sorts of perks and benefits found themselves getting quite the opposite. So as I mentioned earlier, being able to reclassify workers as independent contractors means that they don't get many of the protections that ordinary employees get. And let me also be clear about one thing. I mean, ordinary employees in the United States, it's not like they're enjoying like a great work environment right now. Obviously, we need to do more to increase the protections, but also the power of workers in workplaces across the country. Now, putting that aside for now, let's talk about the fact that they don't get workers' compensation if they're reclassified as independent contractors. In the case of these rideshare apps, remember, we're talking about employees who are using their own vehicles and they're paying for their own gas. They're not being reimbursed for their gas. And that's another issue. They were promised by these companies before Prop 22 passed that if it passes, you could get this reimbursed. We're gonna look out for you. And that's not what happened. Ben Valdez, who's a gig worker in California, said a lot of drivers were duped because they expected they were magically going to be able to qualify for benefits that the companies made it sound like they were going to pay for up front, and that drivers were going to be getting reimbursement for the mileage. They didn't. In fact, Valdez also says, I've had maybe 3 or 4 nights where I literally made $4. So some of you might wonder, how is that even possible? Well, under this law, Uber gets to avoid paying their workers when they do not have someone in their vehicle. So if they're on the road looking for someone to give a ride to, they're not getting paid for that time. They only get paid for the rides that they give. Also, a study by labor economists at the University of California, Berkeley in October of 2019 found that Prop 22 guarantees a minimum wage of just $5.64 an hour, as only engaged time is accounted for in the wage calculations. And one other graphic, because it's important for you guys to know all the details here. Shortly after Prop 22 passed, several gig apps announced fees for customers in California would increase to cover the cost of Prop 22 benefits after several of the apps claimed prices would hike if Prop 22 didn't pass. So they're facing some legal consequences for that lie, because I'm sure that persuaded some consumers in California to vote in favor of Prop 22, thinking that they wanted to, keep the costs of using these services low. But at the end of the day, these rideshare companies decided to hike the prices up anyway. So when I say that the Biden administration made the good move here, I really do mean it. But I'm still uncomfortable with where we're at. The Labor Department's decision here is important because they effectively prevented a Trump-era rule from taking effect. But it's not enough. We need to do more to ensure that what happened to workers in California doesn't happen to workers across the country.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.